Understanding modern American gun culture. It's a doozy. I didn't realize how much until I started working on this episode. Now, I originally recorded this as one giant episode, over an hour, an epic. But I'm going to split it up into parts. If you're a patron, you get the whole thing early and ad-free in toto, in one big chunk. This installment is going to be from the 1980s to September 11th, 2001. Spoiler alert, pretty big event happened that day. Trying to grasp an understanding and different turning points, historical events, even politics, and how that shaped how we got here in American gun culture. Quite a bit different and more in depth than, comparing two different cartridges and stuff like that we often do. But I think if you want to understand where we are, we must look at history. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, hunting. Today, American gun history. The right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. If you want to know my bona fides, there'll be bullet points in the show notes. By modern, I'm going to start in the 80s. I'm a child of the 80s. I was born in the early 80s. And some of my earliest memories and pictures are me walking around with weapons, guns, things like that. Hunting, I love that. Been into guns since I can remember being into anything. Now, obviously, we could go back and back and back. The 80s era is going to be largely influenced by the Vietnam War that came before it, and then World War II. We could go back. But for modern, let's start in the 80s because I can speak from first-hand experience there. Let me also start with the caveat that I grew up in the very poor, rural South. My gun culture experience may have been different if I had grown up affluent in California or Wyoming. And let me also give the caveat that this is very sloppy. It's not A to B to C. Like this happens, then this happens. There's a lot of things going on at once, and there's a lot of overlap. The 80s. Action movies were perhaps in their golden era. And as much as I don't like to admit it, pop culture and Hollywood has a lot to do with what's popular in American gun culture. I wish that wasn't so, but it is so. Action movies generally involve guns. The creme de la creme in the 80s action movie era was the Beretta 92, SIG 226s, and pretty much anything made by HK. American gun culture is often shaped by Hollywood, law enforcement, military, and hunting culture. All of those. All of those kind of circles in this massive Venn diagram kind of overlap into this soup that is American gun culture. Now, in the 80s, we went from the 1911 in military service to the Beretta 92. Why it was so popular in Hollywood at the time. This started because many times this is a catalyst for what's popular, not always. The Wonder 9 craze. This took a while to pick up steam or to snowball and roll downhill into law enforcement. In the 80s, there were some law enforcement agencies looking at high-capacity 9mm. 1911s had been used by law enforcement, but most of the time, even in the 80s, even into the late 80s, if you were to look at a city police officer or a deputy sheriff in America, they were most likely going to have a revolver. It was most likely going to be 38 Special and maybe 357. It was generally a 6-shot Smith & Wesson of some kind. Yeah, there were other guns, there were Colts, but mostly it was Smith & Wesson. The vast majority of law enforcement contracts, Smith & Wesson, .38 Special was going to be in the Sam Browne. But we do start to see some semi-auto use. And although the Glock came out in the 80s, it was not immediately popular with law enforcement or anybody else for that matter. We think like, oh, Glocks are so hot today. They're such a big chunk of the market. That was a very slow burn. We do see the introduction of the Glock in the 80s. It was viewed with much skepticism. Polymer had been used in the M16 for decades. That was introduced in the 50s. However, in handguns, it was an unknown. Remember, when I was a law enforcement officer, and this would have been in the early 2000s, skipping ahead, I'm sure it was rooted in times past, I was told by an older cop who was a 1911 aficionado not to leave my gun on the dash or it would melt. So we see the Glock introduced in the 80s. We see the high-capacity 9mm, not a new thing. There's a lot of this that this is not a historical timeline. I know that the Browning high power was around a long time, but it was not really popular, not really part of American gun culture that I can recollect. I don't know of any cops, any major departments. There's probably one cop somewhere, but no major departments that I was aware of that issued Browning FN high powers. Just wasn't a thing. Again, in the 80s, your law enforcement was most likely going to be carrying a revolver, Smith & Wesson 38 Special, maybe 357 Magnum of some kind. We start to see the intrigue into semi-autos, high-capacity semi-autos. You also see in the late 80s the Miami-Dade shootout. This was a major turning point for law enforcement, and this would start the development of one of my nemesis in the gun world, the .40 Smith & Wesson. Hollow points at this era were very much in their infancy. Yes, I know there was different kinds of bullets way before this, but hollow points were just starting to become in common use. And although tons of ammunition was expended by the F.B.I. to stop one attacker, I know there were two, but the first one was taken out of the fight pretty quick. Stop one attacker, the one shot that hit him for a long time, of all the rounds, and it was many, I'm not going to look it up right now, hit him, it failed to penetrate into the heart because they hit him in the side, and it failed to penetrate, arms and bone and things like that. And the takeaway from that was that they needed a better round than 9mm. I don't know if that's the proper takeaway, but that's what got taken away by the F.B.I. Their marksmanship needed to be improved, but they needed a more powerful round, and that started the .40 Smith & Wesson, which would be introduced right conveniently for this timeline in 1990. Obviously, development was before that. Now, in the 90s, again, Glocks were around, not super popular. Although .40 was developed by Smith & Wesson and the F.B.I., Glock beat them to market, I do believe, an affordable, cheap, that time, fairly innovative and new, I know there was earlier ones, but common, affordable and that worked, polymer striker-fired handguns. What's the appeal of these? They're cheap, especially for law enforcement. The Glock has always done a fantastic job of marketing, I think rightfully, rightfully knowing that if you give cops something, regular citizens are going to look at that and be like, oh, the cops use it, it must be good. They give them a sweet deal. We start to see swings towards high capacity and .40 Smith & Wesson. Not everybody. There were agencies that went the Beretta 92 route, and there was also very commonly in this era the early Smith & Wesson semi-autos, still metal on metal, and they were largely double single action. You may have even seen some double action only because, again, we're transitioning from the revolver era. So the Beretta 92, the SIG 226s, the early Smith & Wessons, a lot of those were going to be double single action or even converted to double action only. Also common in this era was the H&K USP. On the civilian hunting side, I know that polymer existed. Like their polymer stocks were older than this, but in general, you were still looking at blued steel, stainless steel, largely because of Ruger, was not unheard of. There were a few stainless steel guns. Maybe iron sights, maybe an optic, but blued steel, walnut. This was pre-pick rail. You'd still probably be using it Weaver style rings or Leupold style rings. This was in the era where if you wanted to shoot far, max point blank range and high velocity flat shooting cartridges were the soup of the day. Okay, something tragic happens. A great infringement on the Shall Not Be Infringed Amendment in the 1990s. 1994, a year that should live in infamy, the Clinton assault weapons ban. And I'm not going to say anything bad about Clinton. I don't want to get super political, but he did put into place the assault weapons ban. I don't think, unless you live through it, you can appreciate the amount of restrictions that were put on the American shooter, firearms enthusiast in the assault weapons ban in 1994. This was not just a ban on, they would deem an assault weapon like an AR-15, but semi-automatic handguns. Any magazine, I believe, any detachable magazine had to be 10 rounds or less. So pre-ban, remember there were these high-capacity guns in the early 90s and even back into the 80s, but these magazines now became worth like their weight in gold. And they used to be, any high-capacity magazine after this literally was stamped military law enforcement use. Not for you peasant civilians. If you wanted a pre-ban one, it was pretty expensive, and you could obviously only get pre-ban ones in firearms that existed. The only real common ones at the time were Beretta 92, and SIG 226s were way less common. When Glocks were around, they weren't super common. This was the assault weapons ban. Now, this didn't affect the AR a ton, because the AR at this point was not super popular. You might think, well, it's been around since the 50s. It was military service since the 60s. Yeah, but it didn't have a great reputation in Nam. Before my era, before the point of this podcast, but they weren't super common. Colt made them. They were available on the civilian market for a long time, but they were crazy expensive. Not like today, where they're one of the more affordable semi-autos. These were not affordable back in the day. They were really the only game in town, maybe Bushmaster a little bit, but really the AR market was not what it is today. They were not super popular when the assault weapons ban kicked in. A few people had them. If you're a hardcore gun guy, military guy, you may have a Colt, but they were not common. More common at the time was the Mini 14. And sadly, as much as I love Ruger decided to side with the gun banners and assault weapons ban people. And maybe coincidentally, but suspicious, the Mini 14, which was popular at the time, was not nearly as regulated as an AR-15 or an AK-47. There were a few AKs on the market. There were war bringbacks, but they were not super common at this time. Remember, the late 80s, early 90s had not seen that flood of surplus from the collapse of the Cold War. Let me talk about that. In the 90s, and there were some surplus stuff on the market before this, obviously. We're talking about Cold War surplus. When this starts becoming available, it starts in the assault weapons ban era, really. And when I was growing up, the affordable deer rifle was the SKS, because these are 10 rounds, and they were not affected by the assault weapons ban. You could get an SKS, and the market was flooded with good SKSs. This is the golden era of the SKS. A lot of them on the market. They were one of the few things that could be imported as far as semi-autos go. Not only were the guns affordable, the ammunition was crazy affordable. Spam cans on spam cans. Fat stacks of spam cans. And the Mosin Nagants. The Mosin Nagants were crazy cheap. You might be looking at, under $100 for the SKS, maybe a little over $100 for SKS, and literally racks of them at department stores. And this was 90s money, but it was still very affordable. And the Mosin Nagants. You could take your pick on Mosin Nagants. You could get hexagon receivers, you could get finished Mosin Nagants, which were never super common, but the market was so flooded, if you wanted one, you could spend a little bit more and get one. So if you wanted a bolt action that was even more powerful, and spam cans of ammo, this ammo is, I think, even more affordable. Like, just ridiculous prices on 7.62x54R. And this was not super old surplus at the time. I mean, it was a bit old, but the ammo was still good. So these were the big surplus items there. So in the handgun world, I mean, it was people, I think, were throwing in deals of buy this and you might get a Nagant revolver, but who wants a Nagant revolver unless you're just Cold War collector? I mean, those things are about worthless. So there was the Makarovs, which was in a weird round, but again, a lot of the ammo was affordable, so you might have seen people with Makarovs, Takarovs. These were also on the market. These were single stacks, so you didn't have to worry about the assault weapons ban really affecting them too much. 1997, the North Hollywood Shootout. This was before I worked for L.A.P.D. I would later go on to work for L.A.P.D. This was before that. Obviously, we learned a lot about it being L.A.P.D. But if you're not familiar with the North Hollywood Shootout and how it affected American gun culture, you may want to look into it. Homemade body armor. Obviously, assault weapons ban did not work. It did not stop these criminals from getting normal capacity guns when everybody else, the peasants, were regulated to not that. Also, LAPD was not carrying AR-15s at the time. Again, they've been around a long time, but they weren't super popular, even in police work. Even when I was on quite a bit later, the standard issue long gun was a Remington 870 or an Ithaca. More likely a Remington 870, buckshot slugs. Probably just buckshot. LAPD literally went to a sporting goods store and got rifles. And then LAPD, LA later, bans gun stores in Los Angeles proper. Which, anyway, I don't want to get too far into politics, but the North Hollywood Shootout did affect police work. In gun culture as a whole, people saw this. It was like covered by the news. It was a very long, drawn out, lot of rounds fired shootout in a major American city. Backing up a little bit before this, also in Los Angeles, the L.A. riots. This was a big, big deal. It was a big deal culturally. I'm not going to touch on that. As far as race relations go in the U.S. and police, this would have ramifications stretching into very modern stuff, like George Floyd. But as far as gun culture goes, the riots and the famous, rooftop Koreans and armed citizens standing up against thuggery and bad actors. And for the first time since maybe the Watts riots, the Zoot Suit riots, for the first time in modern television history, we saw mass civil unrest on American streets. And the American civilians and law enforcement took note of this. Now, this is a very, very fuzzy timeline, but somewhere in the late 80s, optics were not great. There were some decent optics that were pretty spendy in relationship to firearms, but again, very fuzzy timeline. These were small incremental changes, but you went from kind of an era where you had to pick good optics or cheap optics, decent, affordable optics, and this would have been somewhere in the late 90s and going into the 2000s. You started seeing decently reliable, good, like the Weaver K series, predates this and stuff like that. Again, good or affordable. Generally, you didn't get both. You started seeing good, affordable optics starting to come into common use in the late 90s, in my opinion. And it could have been before that. I was a poor boy in the South. I didn't run anything with optics until the 2000s. Yes, they existed, but nobody I knew hunted with them. As far as being affordable, durable, decent optics. It was, again, a very gradual, slow burn for this. It wasn't like one day you started seeing a bunch of optics on rifles. But it started to be just for the Western hunter aficionado who really wanted the latest and greatest to have an optic on his rifle. Then almost as cleanly as the 1990 and the 40 Smith & Wesson, in 2001, an event that would affect all of us, especially myself, because I had already joined the Marine Corps at the time, September 11th, 2001. Hey gunfighters, that's where I'm going to call it for this installment. Hopefully you stay tuned for the next installment. Make sure you're subscribed, where you get it when it comes out, and leave a review of the podcast. If you want the whole thing early and ad-free, become a patron. But even if you don't, make sure you're subscribed, and hopefully leave a review, hit some stars. I appreciate you guys. I hope you hear me again on the next installment of Modern American Gun Culture. Thanks, and have a blessed day.